shows up.
Yeah, so I'm now seeing your pre-PowerPoint, and I'm now seeing the actual PowerPoint.
Okay. Do you want me to leave it up or get rid
Yeah,
of it?
it's actually it's a good slide to start us with. So yes.
Okay.
That's great. Now all we need is a handful of people, and we'll be good to go. Let me see if maybe I missed something else cool in this piece of paper. Launch the meeting, bring up the participants, claim the host, enter the host key, hit record to cloud. Yeah, oh good. And no one is coming. I just have a phone number in case something goes wrong. So. Oh, and I have my own notes, so I guess I should get that too. I'm still feeling the time change from yesterday pretty badly. So.
When did you travel to Los Angeles?
Like I left London, it was an all-day thing. I left London at like 5 a.m. Got to the hotel by about 3 p.m. California time. So it took a long time. And then and Basil and I still went out on the town last night. So it was a longish day certainly for me.
Hi, Susan and Dan. I see you. Nice to see you. And Catherine, I don't think we've met Catherine, but nice to see you here in the room with us.
Sure, are you seeing things I'm not? Do you seeing people joining?
Yeah, there's people joining in the Zoom room. They think they get automatically put in.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And
Steven, I'm just going to grab some more water. I'll be right back.
okay.
Uh-oh, I might be in the wrong room. See you all.
Kind of organizing team and we know my lesson thinking of it. Why are people still saying and I you know, obviously I think one thing about that, two other things kind of along those same lines.
Well, we do have some data.
Oh my goodness.
So group, what session is this? Because I see the PowerPoint, and is this ethical principles for judges, or is this the one on big law?
The big law one is after us.
Oh, okay, I'm off on time, so that's the
Yeah,
deal.
I think
Okay.
that one's starting at, I have on my schedule at least, that one's starting at 7 Eastern. Big law.
Okay. So I had it, yeah, 6 Central. Okay, so who knows? All right. Well, then, Amy, I get to chime in some of you, or at least listen to some of what's going on in Canada.
You learn lots about judges and ethics. Yeah, well, glad you're here.
Yeah.
By happenstance.
It's been so long since we've had a chance to see each other in person.
I know. Hopefully that's going to come soon.
Yeah. Well, as we're killing time, I'll share with you some of what you all maybe know about in the US about all of the, workplace safety issues in terms of the judiciary. So I'm
Right.
not sure.
Yeah, no, please. I was looking into it a bit after there was obviously hearings on the issue and some public. And there was a survey done that they kind of had to pull back, I think. Is that, and you're doing work in that area, right?
I did, yeah, I just did a symposium piece, so I'll send it your way.
Thank you.
Okay, I know we're slightly after 2. I just did a quick walk down the hallway, and none of the other in-person sessions have started yet either. So I propose we give it a couple more minutes still.
There you are.
I am here, and I think the tech is actually working. So yeah, no, it's a bit of a minor miracle. Hello.
I thought I probably would be late, but.
Yeah, I actually went out and looked at some of the other rooms and asked whether when I was setting up here, I'd missed a directive that we were changing the start time, but A, apparently not, but B, nobody has started yet, so. It ran, yes, right. Okay, well, yeah, we'll give it a few more minutes just to see if,
I know one other person is coming here,
okay. That's very helpful.
probably more. But definitely.
I enjoyed that one before lunch, actually, that was good.
Yes.
It was good. Yeah, it was good. I struggled with yours because part of it was to me just an automatic yes.
Yeah.
Which is like anything that kind of in an objective sense should be on the record, like anything that really should be part of the court process.
Yeah.
That just seemed like, of course, that's right. But then when you get into the in-office stuff, like I started thinking about like in my life, like, well, what interactions could I have with colleagues or students or whatever that could raise similar kinds of complaint type concern? And I said, wouldn't I have to just have a camera running in my office the whole time? Like,
I think it's more the like Brad question. The question Brad was asking about interaction with law clerks.
yes,
Like that stuff for like employees
yes,
is where it gets really tricky.
I think that's right.
It's the in-office stuff where you mean like if you're meeting in chambers with counsel.
No, that, yeah,
That part
I put that in that should be on the record category. Yeah. That is easy. That is actually part of the proceeding.
I agree with
And
you.
so that part's easy.
Everything else is, like,
Everything else,
I don't know.
like
I don't
you-
know
like-
where I would draw the
like
line.
what I found it interesting was you saying, well, I'm not advocating a body camera. And yet part of me was going, well, you sort of are, right? Like to really catch all the other stuff. I'm not sure how else you do it.
No, I guess what I'm saying is. I don't know where to draw the
Right, okay,
line. I'm saying
fair enough.
all of the clearly.
Yep, the easy stuff.
oriented stuff, I do think it should be.
And I think that was easy.
The more you think about potentially covering some of the other stuff,
Mhm.
I do think. It's good. I just think you would really have a lot to consider about confidentiality, about
Mhm.
where you would start to create problems rather than solving.
Yes, I agree.
Um,
And negative impact on people's behavior. Like, so part of it is about, does this condition good behavior? But part of it also is, does this condition the idea that I'm being watched all the time? Like, right? Like,
I was quite interested in the presentation as well, like from the perspective of judicial independence, because thinking about some of the countries where we're working, and I don't know if you're familiar at all with the situation in Kazakhstan, but there they are very quickly digitalizing everything connected to justice right now. So they have this, they call it like a command center, I think. There's an enormous screen. And they can look into every single courtroom, watch every single judge all the time, and right at any moment. It's in the Supreme Court. Oh, and this is of course the system. I would say very weak separation of powers,
yeah,
to put it in a general terms, and so this could also be really have a strong chilling effect on the ability of the judge to independently adjudicate the decisions. But on the other hand,
so it's just observing where they're reporting all the time as well.
and it's important. It's a really important, and they showed it to us. It says somewhere up in the corner, and then every action of the judge they can review with and you can check it.
They can't, like remove it and say anything, can they, the time.
I haven't been in
It's not
another
like,
place
it's
where
not
they
like,
are.
nothing's knocking their kind of like, no, you won't.
This conversation makes me think of the analytics piece too, is once you get more and more of this information, what kind of data crunching and patterns can you draw? The implications are pretty profound if digital records that become public, and then they start, getting run for eye contact and all kinds of things, language used.
Yeah, because there is a movement for like AI in.
Exactly.
AI in judging and then, predictive, it can be taken to a part.
okay, I propose, I think that we start, and it's possible that people will join because they're still making their way up from lunch. But in order to have a good shot at finishing within the allotted time, I propose we make our start. So I want to thank our attendees for attending this session. I want to thank the organizers for including this particular panel. I'm not going to say very much at the beginning about the substance, in part because we have an introduction that will start off from one of our presenters, so I don't need to do very much in that. What I will say is just a little bit about the format that we're going to follow. We're going to speak in turn, each for a maximum of 15 minutes. And then we propose to do the questions at the end. So if people could save their questions for after the group collectively of presentations, we'll just work through them. We're not going to go in the order on the programs. There's a method to our madness. There's a logic to the way we're going to present it. And so the order of presentation will be Brent, and then Jula, and then Pooja, and then Amy, and I will present last. And so I think that's everything from a procedural standpoint, and that just leaves it to me to turn it over to Brent Cotter as our first presenter. Brent, you're muted there, yeah.
There we go. Thank you very much, Stephen, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about this project. Many of you who are Canadian legal academics will be familiar with the subject. It's been given some consideration in Canada over the last few years. I had been involved as an advisor to the Canadian Judicial Council, about which I'll speak in a moment. And as a result, I may have some limitations in the ways in which I can respond based on some degree of confidentiality, but I'll be, to the extent that people are interested, as transparent as it's possible for me to be. My suggestion with respect to the title of the topic is that the concept that the judiciary worked toward was thinking about whether or not they could be crafting through a new version of ethical principles for judges, the concept of the ethical identity of a Canadian judge. I was tempted to put a question mark at the end of the title because I'm not prepared to say definitively that the project succeeded, but at least you'll have a sense of what the goal was. There's nothing magic in the slides. There are about 7 or 8, but they give you at least a little bit of the framework for my remarks. And I think some organization to the project, how it came together, and some of the major achievements or changes at least. For those of you not familiar with the Canadian judiciary, senior judges, often referred to as Superior Court judges, are appointed by the federal government. Many, let me call them lower court judges, are appointed by provincial governments and serve in provincial courts. This focus on ethical principles for judges is directly, at least, related to the senior judges. And it was crafted under the auspices of the Canadian Judicial Council, a body created in the 1970s and composed of leading senior judges across the country, chief justices and associate chief justices of Canada's superior courts. Right now, there are slightly more than 40 who make up that council, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada is the chair of the Canadian Judicial Council. The council had, in the mid to late 1990s, initiated and adopted ethical principles for judges 1998. I'm calling it 1998. Crafted in large part by Chief Justice Richard Scott, the Chief Justice of Manitoba, and Professor Thomas Cromwell, as he then was, as many of you will know. Professor Cromwell became a judge and ultimately served with distinction in the Supreme Court of Canada for about a dozen years before retiring recently. In 2016, the Canadian Judicial Council reflected on the not exactly out of dateness, but the need to modernize and incorporate some new conceptions into ethical principles for judges. The initial motivation for its modernization, I'll mention in a moment, but the project began in 2016. At the initiative of some of the judges on the council, 5 areas in need of modernization or incorporation into ethical principles for judges was considered, as well as a shopping list of about 25 modest changes, tinkering, I would have called those. Let me say at this point that you may be familiar with the joke about economists. That is that there are 3 types of economists: those who can count and those who can't. If you look at the 5 areas listed here, what you will notice is that there are 6, which might suggest that ethical principles advisors can't count either. The 6th of this list was added in the process of the work that that was being done. And I'll come back to the structure of that work in a moment. But the motivation was around judges and self-represented litigants. I put in green here a square bracket of my sense of the degree to which that was well addressed by this project. I won't speak to it, and I won't speak a lot about the substance of these. I think the other commentators will dig deeper into it. Second, judges in social media. There was no social media in 1998. There is an incorporation, but as you can see here, I describe it as a light touch. Judges and other forms of dispute resolution, what we used to call alternate dispute resolution, new and busy areas for judges. Judges in public engagement, the degree to which they should be less cloistered than they have been or conceived to have been. Judges in post-retirement activities, and judges and continuing professional development. This was new in the process as a result of deliberations of other committees of the Canadian Judicial Council focusing on judicial education. The process was undertaken by a committee of the Canadian Judicial Council composed of 7 or 8 of those Chief Justices and Associate Chief Justice, and 3 puny judges, that is not chiefs, chaired by Chief Justice, co-chaired by Chief Justice Martel Popesco of Saskatchewan and Chief Justice Deborah Smith of Nova Scotia. At the outset, 2 advisors were appointed, me and Danielle Jutras, known to many of you as former Dean of McGill Law School, presently Rector or President of the University of Montreal, a talented academic and intellectual. This was to ensure that the work was done in French and English in a collaborative, parallel way. The process was that discussion papers on these 5 or 6 priority areas were developed in the early going. Committee met regularly over 5 years, engaged in 2 sets of consultations, one quite a broad one, and the Canadian Association for Legal Ethics was a significant contributor. And then again, some consultations right near the end as the draft, a document was moving toward finalization in 2020 and 2021. In my view, there were some strategic decisions taken with respect to this document. One was commitment to concurrent drafting in English and French. The previous version was written in English and then translated. Secondly, and this is a sensitive topic, the document would continue to be aspirational and not a code of conduct. Third, that the priority issues, that list of 5 or 6, would be embedded into the existing framework of 5 substantive chapters rather than there being separate chapters being written. The document needed to be restructured somewhat and the language tightened from the old version. There needed to be an effective and searchable index and searchability for the document. And a committee that was struck in 1998 of puny judges, that is not CJC members, who would be available as an informal confidential ethics advisory committee that would be continued. The key outcomes, I think, were the incorporation of those 6 priority areas into the document, whether well or poorly is open to many people's judgment. The continuation of the document as aspirational ethical guidance. I think greater discipline in the structure and language of the statements, principles, and commentaries, which is the way the document is constructed, and some reorganization to make some aspects of that a bit more sensible. And I've listed here in my judgment the incorporation of guidance on some key issues not previously addressed. Harassment to some degree appears in the document. The concept of respect, and indeed it's actually now part of the title of one of the chapters, integrity and respect. Competence is somewhat touched on in the document, cautiously I would say, but somewhat touched on, but is also in the title of the chapter that used to be diligence. It's now diligence and competence. There is a degree of recognition of diversity and Indigenous perspectives, although many online will know that it is not as rich as some people urged. There is some reorganization to the document. There's an improved structure to the chapter on impartiality, which is a very long chapter. It was half the document previously. And the document is drafted equally. Drafting equality in English and French took place, and actually I think enriched the document because some of the ideas in the language of the French version bled into and helped improve the English one. I had selected as one small example the presentation of the structure of the document, and I just chose this little piece about judges conducting themselves respectfully and with integrity, and then a principle related to that, and then a commentary. I chose this just simply to identify the way in which the language of the document is structured. There's a very broad statement written in the declarative form, that is, this is what judges or an ethical judge does. The principles try to state it in the same way, nearly always in a positive way. And then the commentaries are nearly all written in this aspirational language judges should be alert to. If you're familiar with the document, you will know that there is some deviation on that last point. In some places, the language of aspirational would actually itself be offensive. And so there's some tinkering with that. But this just gives, for those unfamiliar with the document, an example of the structural framework on one minor point, a new one actually, but still a minor point. Broad questions for reflection. Does ethical principles for judges 2021 go far enough? It's likely that there will not be a revisiting of this document for another decade. The committee was reluctant to maintain a watching brief, as tends to happen in other jurisdictions. And so they have treated this as their final work, and maybe in a decade, someone will say there are some new things to be added or it needs to be reworked. Second question, does the document articulate the ethical identity of a Canadian judge in an effective way? And thirdly, what is the relationship between the ethical principles document and judicial conduct and judicial misconduct questions that the Canadian Judicial Council is responsible for? Let me conclude there, Stephen, and at the right time, if you have questions, I'd welcome them. Thanks very much.
Okay, Brent, thank you very much. If you could stop sharing the screen, then that would help.
Consider it done.
Excellent. Okay, we turn next, as Brent has indicated, he has set the stage for us, and what we will then do is have a series of presentations on particular aspects or elements of the Ethical Principles 2021, and we're going to start that with Jula Hughes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Stephen, for chairing, and thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to participate in today's panel remotely. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation, a signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. My topic is impartiality, and Brent was just saying that the old EPJ had half of it dedicated to impartiality, and that really hasn't changed very much. There's still about half of the document deals with impartiality. So there's many things that we could talk about under this heading, and I will today choose to speak about two areas in particular and make maybe some brief comments about a third at the end if time permits. The first is the changed understanding of the meaning of impartiality, and the second focus area is about the ethical implications of an expanded and shifting judicial role. If I get to them, the final remarks will be about the law of waiver and some of the problems that the new APJ, I think, creates with respect to that area of the law. So, to my mind, the most momentous change is with respect to the very understanding of impartiality. In the 1998 version, the understanding of impartiality really drew on some Supreme Court of Canada decisions that broadly equated impartiality with neutrality. And in so doing, the ethical principles and the Canadian Judicial Council sided with a majority of the Supreme Court of Canada in the RDS case. It's worth noting probably that about a decade earlier, almost a decade earlier, Madam Justice Bertha Wilson, in her much cited article, Will Women Judges Really Make a Difference?, had already fully expounded on the problems of this conception of impartiality as neutrality, both as a practical impossibility and noting that the law that had been developed by an all-male judiciary displayed a gender bias. And so Madam Justice Wilson argued that it would require a dual strategy of judicial education and diversification of the bench to correct this discriminatory tilt that had developed in Canadian law. And many of the strands of argument in that article were picked up in the RDS case by the two women judges then serving at the Supreme Court of Canada, Justices Laura DeBay and McLaughlin. And in the case, they say, and I quote, "In our view, the test for reasonable apprehension of bias established in the jurisprudence is reflective of the reality that while judges can never be neutral in the sense of purely objective, they can and must strive for impartiality. It therefore recognizes as inevitable and appropriate that the differing experiences of judges assist them in their decision-making process and will be reflected in their judgments, so long as those experiences are relevant to the cases, are not based on inappropriate stereotypes, and do not prevent a fair and just determination of the cases based on the facts and evidence." And so you see there reflected this sort of doubt about that equation between impartiality and neutrality. And it is really that concurring opinion that the revised ethical principles now pick up on. And so now that reads, "This obligation of impartiality does not presuppose that judges are free of life experiences, sympathies, or opinions. Rather, it requires judges to be sensitive to their own biases and to consider different points of view with an open mind." And I think this shift in the very understanding of this key judicial ethical obligation of impartiality is truly important and momentous. And before I start to discuss a bit the implications of it, it might be important to just take stock for a moment of what this new understanding includes. So impartiality does not and cannot mean neutrality. Nobody is free of particular ways of seeing the world that are shaped by experiences, values, and views. Secondly, impartiality is not, according to this conception, a character trait, nor is an open mind a personality type or a virtue that adheres to a particular subgroup of people. Instead, impartiality is an outcome, a result of the work of self-reflection and the deliberate effort of maintaining an open mind. And it seems to me that, oh, have we lost our local user host? Should I pause for a moment? Don't know what's happening there. We got local user back. All right, let's try this. This different conceptualization of impartiality, in my view, is really a game changer in two ways. One, it signals an end to the idea that an older, white, affluent, heterosexual, cisgender male judge is some neutral norm that is entitled to a strong presumption of impartiality, while any departure from that identity and life situation of a judge would then diminish the anticipated neutrality of that judge and would therefore attract more strict scrutiny. And I think that's particularly helpful as the Canadian judiciary has become more diverse. It was apparent that women and judges from minority communities have been at greater risk of having their impartiality challenged, and the new ethical principles make it clear that all judges bring life experience and shapes their perspective of their judicial role. So the question cannot be whether the judge fails to meet the criteria of an imagined neutrality of the mainstream. Instead, all judges are equally entitled to a strong presumption of impartiality. And at the same time, and this gets me to the second point, all judges are then also expected to do the work of dealing with their conscious and unconscious biases, their quick judgments, and their stereotypical reasoning. I believe that this makes it possible to ask some meaningful questions of a judge whose impartiality has been challenged. For example, it is possible to ask whether there is evidence in the decision or in the judge's conduct of a sensitivity to their own biases. A judge might, for example, say that as a white woman, she's alert to the fact that she may have unconscious biases against Black men. The judge might go further and articulate that what stereotypes might be in play, for example, dangerousness or deadbeat dads or things like that. and how she ensured that those notions did not distort her evaluation of a Black witness. By contrast, under the impartiality as neutrality framework, judges were often in the difficult position of having to prove a negative, and any visible work of addressing unconscious bias could ironically often be misread as bias itself. So in my view, this new understanding of impartiality in the ethical principles is not only backed by volumes of social science evidence, but is also really helpful to judges whose impartiality is questioned, which again is particularly appropriate in the context of a diversifying judiciary. The second area that I want to talk about is the evolving judicial role, and the revised ethical principles recognize that the judicial role has seen a significant evolution. It notes, and I quote, "Today, judges' work includes case management, settlement conferences, judicial mediation, and frequent interaction with self-represented litigants. These responsibilities invite further consideration with respect to ethical guidance." That's a sound observation. And despite that, the impartiality chapter actually does not address the ethical concerns regarding case management, which in my view is problematic because there's quite a few cases now where bias concerns have been raised precisely in that context. And I think more guidance would have been helpful. But the ethical principles are very helpful when it comes to the settlement conferences and judicial mediation. They highlight the importance of ensuring processes and outcomes that are acceptable to the parties, as well as informed decision-making by the parties and transparency of the process. So they really provide a good framework. They clarify that caucusing is acceptable despite the transparency requirement, and they further alert judges to the risks of arriving at negotiated outcomes that are coercive, unconscionable, or illegal, or that disregard the legitimate interests of non-involved third parties. Similarly, it is apparent that the issues regarding self-represented litigants has reached a mature stage. The ethical principles are very clear on the need to provide assistance to SRLs and draw on the 2006 Statement of Principles on Self-Represented Litigants and Accused Persons that the Canadian Judicial Council had articulated. It recognizes the appropriateness and indeed the obligation of judges to provide assistance to self-represented litigants, notes the need to take measures to ensure a fair process to those litigants, but also cautions about the potential unfairness to an opposing represented party. Most helpfully, I think the ethical principles now address the need to be attentive to the possibility that assistance to the self-represented litigant may be perceived as a bias against the represented party. And it emphasizes in that context that the answer to this problem is not to abandon the self-represented party who is in need of assistance, but to suggest instead that judges should communicate clearly and transparently to avoid perceptions of bias. And I'm looking at the time and I'm thinking, Stephen, I will just leave it at that and pass it on to Pooja for her comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jula. Pooja?
Thanks, Stephen and Jula and Brent. So I'll just start off by saying that I'm joining today from the lands of the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands. And the second thing I wanted to say at the outset is that I'm dealing with some allergy-related cough issue, and that there's a chance that I might have to leave if I lose my voice completely, or if I had one of my kind of, coughing episodes that's been happening in the past few days. And so my apologies to everyone if that happens while I'm speaking. So my focus on this panel is on examining the revised ethical principles document in the Canadian colonial context. And my main response to the document is that this is, in fact, a missed opportunity for the judiciary to consider judicial ethics in relation to the obligation of reconciliation. So I'll begin with the good news. And the good news is that The revised EPJ, in fact, includes 2 specific references to Indigenous peoples. The first is in the introductory section, where it notes that, and I quote, judges are expected to be alert to the history, experience, and circumstances of Canada's Indigenous peoples. And the second reference is in the chapter on diligence and competence, where we find a reference to, and I quote, history, heritage, and laws related to Indigenous peoples as part of the social context issues affecting the administration of justice. So these references are certainly a welcome addition, especially since the original ethical principles document did not include any mention of Indigenous peoples. But the revised principles make no reference to either the Truth and Reconciliation Report or the TRC report, or to reconciliation generally. And so for those here who are not familiar with the TRC report, this was a report published by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was established in Canada as part of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which is the largest class action settlement in Canadian history. And the commission published its report in 6 volumes, and the final one was published in 2015. So what I'm suggesting in this paper, that this lack of reference to reconciliation is a serious and unfortunate omission because of the important questions that the TRC report has raised about Indigenous people's experience of law and justice in Canada. The TRC report, in fact, documents the various ways in which the civil and criminal justice systems in Canada have failed Indigenous peoples. There is considerable literature on how these failures continue to impact Indigenous people's lives to this day. The report specifically notes that the ways in which the justice system, in fact, acts as a barrier and denies Indigenous peoples the safety and opportunities, and this is a quote, the safety and opportunities that most Canadians take for granted. The report also points to sort of racist ideas held by individual judges about Indigenous peoples. It points to the system's ongoing failures that include inadequate response to issues like the disproportionate imprisonment of Indigenous peoples and adequate response to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. So the report clearly highlights the urgent need for significant reform of Canadian law and legal system and the need for judges to be better educated. I should note that there are some notable references in the report to decisions that indicate that some judges do in fact understand how colonial legacies continue to impact Indigenous people's lives and their experience with law, but the larger story is clearly one of systemic failures, lack of understanding of colonialism or racism, and of denial of justice. And so I should also add that even outside the context of the TRC report, so these are all things included in the report, but even outside of that, the story of Indigenous people's encounters with Canadian law and with the Canadian justice system that has often contributed to their further marginalization in a settler colonial state is certainly well documented by historians as well. So, so it's not surprising then that in a section titled "The Challenge of Reconciliation," the TRC report specifically mentions judges as a group that needs to learn, and I quote, how to be more inclusive and more respectful, and how to engage more fully in the dialogue about reconciliation. But in failing to reference either the TRC report or reconciliation, the CJC has in fact missed an important opportunity to begin that much needed dialogue, both within the judiciary and with Indigenous peoples in Canada. So the question for me then really was, why does a document drafted with the explicit purpose of being, and I quote, read by judges and the public as an expression of the judiciary's highest ethical aspirations in the service of justice and rule of law, end quote, not include a single reference to the need for a dialogue about reconciliation? This exclusion is also puzzling because the importance of reconciliation has in fact been recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada in decisions, as well as by at least 2 of its Chief Justices in their public remarks. And I should add that in their submissions to the CJC, both the Indigenous Bar Association and Canadian Association of Legal Ethics had in fact pointed to the TRC report and the need to reference reconciliation in the revised principles. So why this exclusion was the question for me. And the text of the revised ethical principles itself reveals that at least one reason, so if you take a closer look, or when I took a closer look, at least one reason why the CJC chose not to include a reference to reconciliation is what I think is a misplaced concern about judicial impartiality. And I'm suggesting that this concern over impartiality arises due to an inadequate understanding of 2 things: indigeneity itself, what it means, and secondly, the role of empathy in legal reasoning. So in regards to kind of indigeneity, I've already mentioned the 2 places where the revised principles mention Indigenous peoples. In both instances, however, the CJC appears to have, if you look at the text, appears to have been in a rush to clarify that Indigenous peoples are in fact not being singled out to receive any special treatment that may be seen as unfair by others, but rather they are one of several equity-seeking groups in Canada. Both references to Indigenous peoples appear in longer sentences that speak of, and I quote, the diversity of cultures and communities that make up this country, and matters of gender, race, ethnicity, religion, culture, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, mental or physical abilities, age, socioeconomic background. So Indigenous peoples here appear in the text as part of the sort of wider public with which Canadian judges are expected to engage, as it says in the revised principles, as they expand their knowledge of the diversity of human experience in Canada today. There's no doubt that recognition of the significance of knowledge of social and economic context, of diversity, of history, and identities, and thinking about judicial competence in these passages serves an important and desirable purpose. So certainly it does. However, the 2 references to Indigenous peoples appear in the end as nothing more than a nod to the importance of cultural competence, which, as I've argued in elsewhere in a different paper, is in fact an inadequate response to Indigenous people's experiences with the legal system. In fact, even the choice to use the assimilationist phrase Canada's Indigenous peoples and to place them alongside other minority groups and diverse identities, as I mentioned, and diversity of experiences, itself reveals that there is a significant gap in the knowledge around indigeneity. This not only reinforces settler denial and settler innocence, but also serves to further a very problematic liberal politics of recognition, which others have written about. And it also reveals a lack of understanding of a meaningful understanding of what colonialism is and does, and disregards the centrality of self-determination and sovereignty in Indigenous claims in Canada. And so the CJC, I think, has failed to appreciate that the claim of indigeneity is not the claim to a racial or ethnic minority status. That is a different, these are 2 different things. And the manner in which the Indigenous peoples are included in the revised principles is therefore in itself problematic, and sadly ends up undermining the work that the inclusion of the 2 references to Indigenous peoples seeks to achieve. The second point I'll make briefly is that the passages where the wider public and diverse peoples appear as a reminder that Indigenous peoples are not to receive any advantage over any other litigant that appears before Canadian courts, betrays a concern about creating an apprehension of bias that is based, I think, on an inadequate and impoverished understanding of the role of empathy in judicial reasoning. So certainly judicial impartiality is one of the core principles of judicial ethics. Any apprehension that an acknowledgement of the imperative of reconciliation will compromise the value, impartiality, any such apprehension is misplaced, I'm suggesting. The concerns over bias in this context show why it is in fact crucial for the judiciary to develop a robust understanding of what reconciliation means for judges in Canada today. In the context of reconciliation, the competence required of a judge in Canada is not therefore simply a matter of meeting Indigenous peoples and learning about their history and culture, which is what seems to underlie some of the text. To understand what is described in the revised principle as a social context of diverse peoples, including Indigenous peoples. Competence has to be conceived as an ability to recognize and understand the complex truths that are in the TRC report, for example. There are so many other truths, right? The truths of the Indian Act, which governs so much of the lives of Indigenous people, the truths of being an Indigenous person in court today and historically, the truth about the exclusion of Indigenous peoples from courts and from legal processes and from the legal profession. So by excluding any mention of reconciliation in the revised principles, the CJC has lost an important opportunity to signal the importance of learning these particular histories of Canada and of reading the TRC report and many other previous reports in order to acquire the competence to adjudicate difficult issues that are in fact inseparable from these histories. So the questions that even come before courts. Acknowledging the fact of settler colonialism and displacement of Indigenous laws and legal systems does not in itself signal bias or abandonment of legal reasoning. If anything, learning about past injustices, naming wrongs, and treating this knowledge as relevant to independent adjudication of specific issues would in fact allow judges to understand why courts are seen as colonial institutions by many Indigenous peoples, and lead to more awareness of the ways in which legal analysis is informed by ideas and practices of law that enable and have enabled dispossession of Indigenous peoples. A reference to reconciliation in the revised principles would have signaled that an institution that is meant to dispense justice but has often failed Indigenous peoples in fact seeks to redesign the system in order to make it more responsive to Indigenous peoples. This does not introduce bias into the process of judging or compromise judicial impartiality and independence, but rather involves what Franklin describes as, I quote, a mode of interpretation that is essential to judicial reasoning and decision making. And this is the mode of interpretation that involves empathy. On the other hand, the failure of the CJC to acknowledge that a judiciary that is in fact overwhelmingly non-Indigenous needs to begin a conversation about reconciliation could be seen as bias. That is a predetermination that reconciliation is not an ethical imperative before it has even turned its mind to it. So even as specific claims are contested and tried in courts, as they should be, the judiciary, like other institutions in Canada, has to figure out in conversation with Indigenous peoples what kinds of ethical consideration reconciliation invokes. However, the process of reflection and engagement necessary cannot begin until judges find the courage to actually say the word out aloud, and they could have done this by, in fact, including some reference to either the TRC report or to reconciliation in the revised principles, which they sadly haven't done. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm a I think I'm 1 minute over my time and I apologize for that. Thank you.
No, Pooja, thank you. That was terrific. And we're very lucky on our end that you were able to conquer your cough in the short term and get those remarks across. It sounded challenging at times, but we're very pleased you were able to make it. So thank you. Amy, you're up next.
Thank you. I'll be talking today about the updates to the principles that relate to judges and technology. Of course, and now it happens to be a day that my Wi-Fi is not working well. So insert joke about presentation on technology and Wi-Fi not working. So Stephen, if I'm choppy, I'll leave it to you just to move me along and we can bump it so people aren't experiencing that. But so there's two types of things that the updates do with respect to technology. First, we see that they contain a new general duty of judicial technological competence. And as far as I know, this is the first time we've seen this type of general explicit duty included in a judge's code of ethics. And certainly if there's anybody here that has different feedback as what's happening in other jurisdictions, I welcome to learn about that. But certainly, as far as I know, nothing comparable in the United States. I've heard from people. In terms of language use, it states that judges should develop and maintain proficiency with technology relevant to the nature and performance of their duties. And so you have this general duty that speaks to quote unquote relevant technology and this idea of a proficiency. So this need to have an adequate baseline of competency. They also talk about maintaining that proficiency. So it's clearly an ongoing duty as well. So that's something quite new. We can see that the language models somewhat new additions to lawyers' codes that we saw both in the United States and Canada, also introducing this idea of technological competence. So that's one change. Then we see a whole set of changes throughout, or additions throughout that relate to social media. And so there's cautions that judges need to avoid improper influences from social media sources, exercise caution in their use of social media to avoid appearances of impropriety, noting that also includes kind of private use of social media as well, minimizing reasonable apprehensions of bias that can relate to social media use, avoiding engaging in activities on social media that could reasonably reflect negatively on their commitment to equality. So kind of almost a content-specific requirement there. Being attentive to and possibly informing family members of the ways in which their social media activities could reflect adversely on them. And we could probably spend some time going through even each of those, what they might be addressing, maybe what are the problems. I don't have time to do that today. Generally, one thing I want to point out is that social media is dealt with fairly extensively in the document, kind of smattered throughout. There's no standalone section that deals with it. It's integrated into different ethical principles, whether talking about how this technology might be relevant in that context. In terms of why these changes occurred, I can't speak for the committee. Of course, I can say why these changes I think were needed. Obviously, so much has changed in the last 25 years when it comes to hands. Just remember how stark the changes are, how much the world has changed. When I was thinking about this topic, I pulled up some statistics, but when you look back to 1998, when the previous version of these principles were published, approximately 25% of Canadian households were online. The portion now is over 90%. Cell phone use, mobile phone, smartphone use has increased vastly. As Senator Cotter said in his introduction, social media didn't exist in 1998. It really came on stream in the 2000s. And then, of course, have to speak to Zoom. We're on Zoom now, very much part of many of our professional lives. That really wasn't a thing 2 years ago before the pandemic. Looking at courts, you can look at some contemporaneous material from the 1990s and see that in the 1990s, many judges were just getting comfortable with using computers. Courts were just starting to come to grips with maybe using audio conferencing or video conferencing in certain circumstances. Digital systems, to the extent that they were being used, were quite new and in many cases weren't used. And you certainly don't want to oversell how tech savvy courts are now, but I think we can say much has changed. We see computer use by judges being a norm if it's, possibly not universal everywhere. There's some judges that may be holdouts, but a big change there. Digital documents, e-discovery, and of course, a shift to virtual hearings. And so all that together means that, efficient and effective court operations do really require judges engaging with technology and doing so in a competent manner. And I think it's important to look kind of outside what tech is being used in courts and just think about broader society and how use of technology has impacted the work of judging. So, evidence now, can take the form of tweets or emojis. There's been cases where Fitbits have provided evidence and helps, lead to convictions or acquittals in murders. Maybe Google Maps is being used to show a location. Something like metadata may be relevant in a case. And so all this is very much in the world of judging now. And no one's arguing that judges now need to become technology experts. I certainly don't argue that. We have expert evidence being admissible for a reason. But I do think something shifted, and that there is a growing case, an existing case, that there does need to be some baseline literacy when it comes to at least certain technologies that's started to be expected from judges. And then just to touch on social media, specifically for a moment, because it's dealt with so extensively. I think the case line for baseline literacy amongst judges is particularly strong. We don't have really great data, but the data we have says that a significant number of judges are using social media to some extent. And it's certainly an area where, problems pop up more often than not. In Canada, over the last decade or so, we've had judges get in trouble for crude posts. We've had judges get in trouble for creating fake profiles to conduct research on witnesses. Some judges criticized for not understanding basic facts about social media. And if you look at the United States, there's kind of regular issues coming up with judges on social media. And that's been an issue, I think, certainly in Canada, before these principles were updated. We did have, education on this for judges. We had some guidelines produced. But I do think, including it in the ethical principles is important, and it's something new. It emphasizes the importance of using social media properly, not only as kind of a best practices or good thing to do, but also kind of as an ethical issue, and making those connections between impartiality, independence, and the proper use of social media. So that's what the changes are. So now that we have the guidance, I think an important question is, how do we operationalize it? It's one thing to say that judges need to be tech competent, but then of course, how do we ensure that is so? And the guidelines don't provide detailed discussion about what judges need to exactly be doing. They talk about relevant technology. They talk about it kind of generally in relation to certain principles. And certainly you can have discussions about ethics codes and how detailed or not detailed they should be. I think in the area of technology, there's a strong case that being general, talking about using relevant technology is a way to go. This is an area where things can change quite fast. If you try to kind of enumerate detailed practices or specific technologies, it's going to quickly become out of date. And as Senator Cotter said, this isn't a document that's continually updated. So that generality is good. I think it does then put an onus on judicial regulators and educators to make sure that judges are getting the details they need. To take a kind of immediately understandable example on social media, there's lots of questions that we can see judges having to deal with if they're on social media that the guidelines don't talk about. Can judges participate on social media using pseudonyms or fake profiles? How should judges approach the question of who to connect with on social media? Can they friend everybody that they want to? Do they have to accept all friends' requests? Conversely, can they block people if they want to? Can judges write, reviews on crowdsourced social media like Yelp or TripAdvisor or something like that? And so these are the sorts of details, just using kind of social media as an example, that, if judges really want to do their best with technology in a practical way, they need to have guidance on these issues. And certainly we do see that this guidance being developed in Canada and other jurisdictions. It's just a matter of continuing to do it. A lot of the guidance on technology is social media specific, so also starting to broaden think beyond the question of social media. I also think we talk about how to kind of operationalize this. We need to understand this is an area very much so where we can't all individualize the responsibility. So a judge is going to have, unreliable technology or tech supports, not have good systems in place. It's going to have a hard time appearing or actually using technology competently. So there's a systems level issue there. Beyond competence, I think there are other kind of systems levels issues that can be interesting to talk about. To give a concrete example, I recently was able to read some PhD work from an individual at the University of Montreal, Anastasia Kanina, and she explored really interesting issues in relation to procurement, particularly of case management systems and questions of judicial independence. And so in Canada, we have Supreme Court jurisprudence saying, part of judicial independence is court administration, assigning judges to case, picking courtrooms, determining sittings of courts. That's all can potentially influence adjudication. And what her work was looking at is when you have private actors selling tools to courts that automate some of these systems, not necessarily transparent about how they're doing, not necessarily taking public values into play, that can create a problem. And so she's looked at how we might embed some of those public values into the procurement process, or also think about the whole issue of privatization. That gets us a little bit far away from the ethical principles, but I think looking at these systems levels, capacity building, systems level choices is an important part with technology, because there's only so much judges have control over. And those choices, I do think, have ethical salience and ethical implications. Just looking at the time there, I'll wrap up fairly shortly. I also wanted to end by looking a bit to the future. We have this duty of judicial technological competence. What might be some of the future issues or emerging issues that judges might be facing? Obviously, hard to predict the future, but I will highlight kind of 3 areas that may be of interest. First is the area of AI-generated evidence in court. I think there is a current need, at least in some judicial rules, for competency in this area. What am I talking about? Maybe some easily kind of understandable examples are facial recognition evidence. Another area where there is actual use and actual issues occurring are tools that use AI to generate DNA genotyping, and there's been some controversy over that. And in addition to some of the controversies, either about bias or accuracy or reliability, there's just new questions these tools bring up, like how does a party challenge evidence processed by an algorithm? We haven't really had to face this, fully before, and I think these are new questions judges will have to deal with. Also, I think important to think maybe about the darker side of AI-generated evidence. So deep fakes, I don't know if people are familiar with that term, but we have kind of video or audio that's created to appear like someone else and can seem quite accurate. There are concerns about those deep fakes appearing in court as evidence. We aren't at a place where this is a huge concern, but it's also not entirely theoretical. There was a family law case, I think it was the UK, I think it was England, where there was deep fake audio presented and was thankfully discovered, but this may be an issue courts will have to deal with, and judges are going to have a some baseline literacy about these issues. Second, there's a lot of writing about what's called automated decision-making, ADM, in justice systems. In the United States, this has come under scrutiny because there has been the use of tools that use algorithms that assist judges in both bail and sentencing. Also another area where there's been concerns about bias and reliability. Haven't seen a huge amount of use in Canadian courts, but certainly something that has been investigated and maybe part of the judicial role. And again, here, baseline literacy. You won't necessarily need to be a machine learning expert or understand how to program algorithms. I'm not saying that, but you need to understand what's at play and what's at stake. Finally, a big area of interest of mine is judicial analytics tools that we're seeing more and more of. So you have these tools that use advanced technology to analyze patterns in court data. So the commercial uses really are sold to litigators. We can tell you how likely this particular judge is going to rule in your favor. We can tell you what types of cases or what types of language this judge wants. But it's also interesting kind of to think on the flip side about how judges themselves may use these tools. If these tools, what they're good at is looking at patterns. If you can find patterns that maybe indicate certain types of concerning bias, or maybe some substantive issues. If we can have tools that can be used in that way, is there a role to kind of audit judicial practices where judges can use it, not in a punitive way, but maybe to learn more about, what they do when they judge and make corrections where appropriate, or just gain insights? Will that start to be expected of judges to, basically analyze what they're doing? We're not there, but I think it's also not a wild futuristic scenario to think that we may get there as more data becomes digitized, as these tools become more powerful. So I think that's it with my time. A little picture on technology. Welcome any questions, and I'll turn it over to Stephen at this point.
Thanks very much, Amy. So in my final one of these presentations, I want to look at two related topics. I've had the past benefit of having co-authored a piece on each of these topics, and both of them now make an appearance in the new version of Ethical Principles. One of them is the phenomena, much more common here in the United States, previously not very common in Canada, but becoming increasingly common, the phenomena of judges returning to the private practice of law after they've completed their judicial career. And the second topic is confidentiality. So judges and an obligation to maintain confidentiality of information that they receive in the course of performing their functions as a judge. So on the first of those issues, the return to practice phenomena, we now see, I think, in strong recognition of the fact that this is starting to become a thing in Canada, and particularly over the past 10 years, and particularly for the most senior of Canadian judges. So it tends not to be trial level judges. It actually tends to be former Supreme Court of Canada judges, our highest court, or judges of provinces' highest courts, courts of appeal of various provinces, are in increasing numbers retiring as judges and then going back into private practice as counsel with law firms. This is as a phenomena that sort of was not even a blip on the radar really back in 1998. Not surprising, the previous version of the principle says nothing about this phenomena, but as Brent indicated, this was a theme that the revision project specifically identified up front as something that now had to be addressed. And so the important general statement, there's a few statements in the document. The document, by the way, I should say, and maybe should have said this in the introduction, but I took it maybe as implicit. The document is freely available electronically. So it's on the CJC's website for anyone who sort of wants to actually find the text of this document. So the important general statement in 5E2 is that former judges should be attentive to the ways in which their post-judicial actions or activities could undermine public confidence in the judiciary. So there's a clear link established between what an individual former judge might happen to do now back in practice and how that might reflect on the judiciary as an institution, right? So not necessarily how it reflects on that individual person, but how it reflects on the institution itself. That's pretty principle. That is a principle level, but there are also some specifics. So in 5E2, the principles provide that former judges should not appear as counsel before a court or tribunal in Canada. And so that's directive. That's a mandate. That's I would say that's not even aspirational. It says that. It says if you're a former judge, you don't do this. And one of the things that's very interesting about that is this is much more restrictive than the current ethical rules for lawyers themselves, which would include judges who've now gone back to becoming lawyers in almost all provinces, right? So the CJC here is really leading in this admonition against going back and arguing cases in court, which has been over the last 10 years or so, one of the hot button sensitive issues that's been making the headlines about why we might need to regulate former judges who go back into practice, is some of them are going right back into their former courts and making submissions before their former colleagues. On the second issue, and I always really struggled with this, the previous version of ethical principles did not impose any obligation of confidentiality on judges at all, right? It said nothing about that topic. Now, I think if you asked any judge, they would have taken it as a given that they were under an obligation of a confidentiality, right? I'm not aware of anybody who would say, oh, well, it's not there, so I thought I was free to, write tell-all novels after I retired, but the inner workings of the court and that sort of thing. But my view was, look, I don't care how implicitly obvious you might think this obligation is. It's just not appropriate to have it not actually spelled out in the document. And so in one of my pieces, I made a case for having this into the code, and that got taken up as part of this project. So although it was not one of the themes identified at the outset of things they wanted to do, it did become, as the project went on, in part because one of the things Kale said as part of its submissions was you need to impose an obligation of judicial confidentiality. So that's now in there. There's now, as part of the principle on integrity, there is an explicit obligation of judicial confidentiality. And notably, and linked to the first issue, it specifies that confidentiality and discretion extend past a judge's departure from judicial office. So not just an obligation while you're in the saddle, as it were, but an ongoing till death obligation of confidentiality. All right, so what's my reaction to those changes? They're welcome. So I think everything that I've said is stuff that I have in my written work advocated for. And so I commend the CJC and the committee for these provisions that have been developed. And so my main concern is more in the nature of what could have also been done, right? So there were other, and not just conjecturally, but points that were made to the committee about things that it might have also done in this area, but chose not to do. So one of them is restrictions on former judges on their use of the honorific. So our former judges are, the title of judge or justice is not something they're allowed to continue using, right? Once they retire, they can say they used to be a judge, but they cannot continue to use the title justice so-and-so. But they are given on their retirement the right to use an honorific, the honorable. So formerly Justice Cromwell, for take an example of our Supreme Court, is now the Honorable Thomas Cromwell. And in any legal marketing or websites or promotion or what have you, people seeing that draw. There are in fairness other reasons why you might have the honorable title, former cabinet minister or that sort of thing. But in the legal circles, that's almost always just an indication that this person is a former judge. So it is a way of badging yourself, just as if on your website with the law firm, you kept the photo of you in your robes, right? Which would be another way of trading on, for marketing purposes, that former office. And that's something that I was concerned about, and I've said as part of my work that we should be concerned about the linkage between sort of marketing that former judicial experience. And in fact, on this issue, an earlier draft, which was made public, it was circulated publicly for comment, called for restraint to be exercised in the use of the honorific or any similar title, particularly in connection with marketing and promotion of legal services. And that then got dropped in the final version. And that my pushback on that would be it should have been kept. That was a useful thing that they were some ways along the line to developing, but that didn't make the cut into the final version. And a second thing that concerns me, that again was I see it as a missed opportunity, is, and Americans in the room will certainly be aware of this, the heart, arguably, of the American lawyer rule for former judges is you can't be involved in matters as a lawyer that you were involved with when you were a judge, right? That's just an obvious conflict of interest. We have no such rule. And in the efforts that I've been doing to try to get law societies to revamp their rules, this is one on which there's been absolutely no positive take up. They've seen no benefit or interest in such a rule. And the CJC here saw no benefit in any way purporting to say to former judges, hey, by the way, if you go back into practice, don't get involved in work that you were involved with when you were a judge. So I mean, from the reactions in the room, at least, I'm getting a sense that you know exactly the kind of scenarios I'm thinking of. I mean, you could have a judge who decides a summary judgment motion, retires, joins a law firm, and then acts on the team seeking to uphold his or her own decision on appeal. Or worse, acts on the team seeking to have that decision declared to be wrong on appeal, right? They couldn't go into court. Fine, we have a preclusion. They can't actually go into court, argue the case, which would be even worse. But there's nothing that would preclude them from being part of the legal team of lawyers working on a matter that they were involved with as a judge. So that to me is a missed opportunity. And I have to say, I have yet to see from any regulatory body on the Canadian side, even a sentence of response as to why that isn't a good rule. Like, as I say, that's the heart of the American legal, like rule for lawyers who used to be judges. And it's gotten no traction in the Canadian context. The final thing I'll say is just to talk about sort of steps going forward in these areas. Both the return to practice and the confidentiality piece raise issues about the scope of enforcement. And we talked about this actually in the panel before lunch, because fine, this is the CJC. I mean, these are just aspirational, but even if this were to code, these people aren't judges anymore. So they can't be disciplined by the CJC for any violation of these provisions, right? There's no enforcement mechanism there. One solution, in my view, one of the, I think, low-hanging fruit solutions would be that the legal regulators have to get on board and mirror these provisions so that at least those former judges who do rejoin the practice of law will be caught by similar provisions that are being applied to lawyers. It's not going to get everybody. That wouldn't get at a judge who just retires and then breaches confidentiality. And of course, as we were saying in the panel before lunch, a more radical solution, I think, would be a form of statutory change in the Judges Act to actually give power to discipline former judges, right? That is, you get rid of that idea that just because you cease to hold the job, there's nothing we can do. We're sort of functus or powerless here. And then the getting at the pension idea seems like potentially, I appreciate that that's very controversial. But it's certainly a mechanism by which you could say you're not somehow beyond our reach. And then the final thing I'll say on the next steps is the Federation of Law Societies of Canada. So for those who aren't familiar with that, the Canadian, that's an umbrella organization of all of the various legal regulators across the country. So the law societies in each of the various provinces and territories. They proposed, even before the CJC went into this exercise, an update to their currently very out-of-date rules about former judges who return to practice, particularly to get at the appearing in court issue. And those stalled. And the thought was and they stalled pre-pandemic. And the thought was perhaps that once the CJC went ahead and did its part of the piece, that would then provide the impetus for the Federation to be able to say, okay, fine, we're going to uninstall this and get it done on the legal regulator side. But the best information we have from the Federation currently is that it's still stalled, right? That there's just no movement ahead at all. So our provisions remain as badly sort of out of date and short of the mark as they were a decade ago when this phenomena of returning to practice and going into courtrooms started happening, and when we first started writing and commenting about it. Okay, so I'll stop there to leave some time for questions, and I'm now perfectly happy to take questions. Please, when you ask your question, identify yourself. If you're online, you may need to do various things like flailing your arms or putting up an electronic hand or what have you to get my attention. But identify yourself and institution, if you would, when you ask the question. And if you want to direct it to any of our particular presenters, please indicate that too. Please.
So Amy, this question is for you.
Amy, can you hear the question, or because I can move this microphone, I suppose, if I need to.
Come closer if you can't hear me.
I can mostly hear you. I think so. I'll ask for clarification.
I'll speak up. So
Thank you.
I'm so happy to hear that there's going to be a rule out there that I can refer to about tech competence for judges, because you're right, no, there's nothing in the US. One thing that I am intrigued by is, and I understand that it's just aspirational, and so this wouldn't be something that's being directly used as a code type idea for enforcement, but on the social media side, of course, there are lots of cases both in the US and in Canada and all around the world, but with respect to competence in other areas, what I see in the US, and I'm wondering if this is what you see in Canada, is when it is about something like an out and out refusal to engage with something like, well, I'm just not going to use email. I don't need to know how to do that. That's an easy case for just disciplining. But when it is about maybe more nuanced area, and the example that's coming right to my head is more than nuanced, it's actually quite hard. And that is something like understanding geofencing in order to be able to decide whether to issue the warrant or not. Maybe that is too hard to say, well, you should have understood it. Well, the reality is that the judge actually does need to understand it in order to decide whether to issue the warrant. I'm wondering if those type issues, do you know whether any of those are coming up? And if that is part of what is finally making this become a part of actual, like, you know what, no, we actually need this written in, because I'm not sure why it hasn't actually been written in yet into any code that I've seen in the US, but obviously it needs to be.
Great question. Thanks. And the geofencing is a great example I can add to a presentation in the future. I mean, I can't completely speak to I can't at all speak to the direct motivations of including it here. I think a large part of what led to it was seeing what was happening to lawyer codes and the ABA edition and its commentary, and then we had a commentary edition later. I think this raises a broader question about judicial ethics code and competence in general, because of course, well, not of course, but generally the way that judicial discipline works is a lot of these competence issues are, when it comes to substantive law, of course, dealt with in an appellate review, a judicial review type system, and so they tend to be very hands off, but not completely when it comes to complaints received about competence. Kind of on the substantive law issue that we do see, where there's kind of complete misunderstanding or complete refusal to engage, then potentially there'll be that looked at. And we've had some cases in relation to sexual assault law where that's come up. But we certainly, not to my knowledge, have seen outside of the social media cases, judges using social media inappropriately, of judicial regulators seeing a judge who's kind of refusing to use a particular technology or gain any knowledge. And I think it would be quite hard to regulate. I think we're not seeing a lot of regulation on the lawyer side necessarily either, for similar reasons. There's kind of a reticence to kind of set black and white rules about you need to be using X technology or understanding X. And it's dealt with more as, an indication this is part of the role, and we're going to try and provide you supports for education and guidance, but we're not going to discipline you. Will we get to a point in the future where that's going to become necessary? I think that's quite interesting. But it does, I think, tie into that broader issue about disciplining incompetence, because I think it's something that, absent extreme circumstances, the general judicial disciplinary system isn't inclined to do. Yeah, I hope that answers your question, or
Yeah.
maybe touches on it. I don't know what your thoughts are about prospects of disciplining in that area.
Thank you very much, Chairman and the presenters. My name is Dr. Akin Wadaisi from Adekunle Adeosun University, Nigeria. It's quite interesting, and I need to really celebrate the papers you both have presented. First, Emmy, if I'm right in the pronunciation of your name. The issue of technology and the engagement of technology by judges, I would like you to consider what are the necessary implications and lessons that judges from some jurisdictions that are finding it difficult to actually make use of this system because they are used to the traditional way of dispensing justice. Some will say nobody can take the longhand writing from me. Some will say leave that to the technologists, let them handle. So in such situation, can they engage experts to help them? And if there are experts that are engaged, how does that affect the substance of justice that flow from the judiciary? Then also the question of objectivity. Do you think that engaging technology will actually promote objectivity in justice dispensation? Or do you think also that justice from courts, which of course some scholars say is subjective in nature. So the use of technology, how does it affect the objectivity and subjectivity of the concept of justice? And on computer-generated evidence, which is quite now being used in many courts, and the use of this computer-generated evidence being admissible in court. My worry has been this the involvement, the penetration of what I can call the evil workers and the technology, those who can do Photoshop, who can turn head to toe, who can give the voice of Mr. A to Mr. B. And there are judges who know less about them because they are trained about law, but they are not trained about these technicalities until somebody comes and say, no, with expertise, knowledge to say, this is not the voice of Mr. A. So where comes the work of experts who are not necessarily lawyers or judges, but who can help the judges to dispense their appropriate, justice in this case, to say, okay, this evidence should be admissible or not. So that's my question for you. And I don't know, okay.
But let's let Amy give a chance to, because there's a lot in that. It's a good question.
Very good. I wish I was there in person and we could maybe grab a coffee afterwards and talk about all those issues. I mean, I picked up on a few things maybe that I can just think off the top of my head to respond to. And I think, the issue about having the right supports in place, I think is so crucial. I think, I think probably a lot of these duties have kind of systems levels implication. But I think in particular here, it does. And that leads to kind of courts making good choices about technology, but making sure people have the right supports in place. To some extent, this is also a conversation in the lawyering world where you have people that are just completely obstinate and say, I'm not going to do this. That's always going to be contextual, but I think there's going to be some things that's not an appropriate answer, that part of judging, part of lawyering now does require doing certain things, could a judge say, I'm never going to use a, a telephone or technology? I'm not going to use a pen. At some point, there's going to be this baseline. And the question is, the baseline is moving much faster than it has for a while. On the question of can technology or AI lead to more objective justice? That's such an interesting and huge issue. And there's people that, are spending their whole research agendas looking at that. I think it's a really interesting question. I think, when they first introduced bail algorithms in the United States, that was kind of maybe the promise to take away racial bias of humans when we were making these types of decisions. And what they found was that they trained these computers on past data from the real world, which had all these biases, and it's got reincorporated and reiterated. And, we can have a big conversation about that. And the last issue about kind of providing supports to judges to understand AI generated evidence, I think you're absolutely right. We need those experts. I think I think another thing, to think about as well is the issue of proprietariness. And I know over time, let's quickly mention the issue that one thing in the United States has happened is we have these algorithms come to be presented as evidence in court. And then basically the companies that generate them say that we own the code and you can't look at it. And that's been a huge issue. There's been some victories in court about that. But we've so far seen that, that's been a big issue as well. So the question isn't necessarily, can experts look at it and understand it? Is can they even have access to it? Yeah.
Okay, thanks for those questions and for those answers. I'm going to call it there in the interest of patting ourselves on the back and being able to say we stayed well on time. So please join me in thanking all of our presenters for their efforts this afternoon.
Thanks for being here. Thanks, Stephen, for your chairing.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks to you.
Happy to do it. I'm so pleased the technology held through for us. So it's great. It's great to see everybody. I'm so sorry to be missing the pleasures of your company here in sunny California, but we'll do it again somewhere soon.
Yeah.
Can I just say, Stephen, at the end of this, knowing that many of you are part of the Canadian Association for Legal Ethics, although the document didn't go as far as some of you may have liked in some places, Indigenous perhaps the most, your contributions and influence were significant in the shape of the document, and you've picked up many of them today on technology, respect, competence, social media, confidentiality, return to practice. It's a reminder of the influence that the Canadian Association has had on matters like this, and I thought you deserve congratulations for that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Brent, for that. And I think it's a two-way street. I mean, I think we felt in our collective participation efforts, I don't think there was a lot of danger we were going to see eye to eye on everything. But I think we thought we were getting a very good hearing for the things that we wanted to address, that the consultation process was good, that the dialogue was good. And I at least at a minimum think of contexts that wouldn't have gone like that. That it didn't necessarily have to be done that way. So I was quite pleased about that.
Well, thanks. And I think you provided the material and the case for proponents who supported the perspectives that Kale or individuals of you were advancing. And that had more influence inside the work of the committee than probably is apparent from the outside. So, and if I can say it in a personal way, thanks to you for that.
Well, you're very welcome. And thank you, Brent. Thank you for all your efforts on it. Okay, I'm going to shut this down. So take care all. And I think we move now to a well-deserved afternoon break.
Bye, everyone. Nice to see your faces.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Should we swing by reception? I mean, not reception, break.